I have done some preparation for today's show, and I've got standing by the video that we produced this time last year, which kind of laid out exactly where we got to 5 years ago. Now, there are a couple of reasons we haven't updated it. First and foremost is there has been no real change in the situation. We had a holding statement from the police back in July of last year that basically said the investigation was ongoing and still nothing was happening. And here we are on the 6th anniversary. So I will hold that one in reserve. But as I mentioned earlier, we've had I had an email conversation with Sadie Cresswell, who is daughter of Ken Cresswell, and because of my involvement in all things post Didcot, I follow Sadie on Facebook, and I think she follows me on LinkedIn. So one way or another, we kind of keep in touch. And I know in the years that have passed since Ken's tragic death, Sadie has actually got married, and I know with each passing anniversary, I think the pain, rather than the pain lessening, the pain seems to actually get worse. I'm going to play you this because this is a précis of the message that Sadie sent to me. This will kind of set the tone for where we are, I think. Could probably leave it there, really. That I've said it so many times. I have no emotional connection to Didcot or to the 4 guys that were tragically and unnecessarily killed on that tragic day. I basically report it because I get the impression that nobody else is. I will say, in their defence, I had a phone call very late last night from BBC South. They want me to go on to. I'm recording an interview with them at 1 o'clock today. I've no idea when that will air, but I'll keep you posted. And if I can get a copy of it, I will certainly share that with you. As I say, I have no emotional connection with the incident whatsoever. But where I come from on all of this is very much industry related, and there's a bunch of stuff that I'd like to discuss and throw out there. So first of all, we already know that this investigation is 6 years and counting. There was, just by way of comparison, there was a boiler house collapse in Ohio in America in December 2020. Here, it took almost 7 months to recover 3 of the bodies of the deceased. In Ohio, it took 1 month. Here, the investigation remains ongoing after 6 years. In Ohio, the incident was investigated, reported, prosecuted, and closed in under 18 months. So it's already taken us 4 times as long to go precisely nowhere. That's part of my issue. The second part of my issue, which with each passing day seems to be less relevant, but I'm going to mention it anyway. At the time of the Didcot disaster, there were about 20 or 25 fossil fuel power stations here in the UK that were facing demolition. There are well over 1,000 around the world, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500. And the fallout from Didcot is being watched by demolition contractors around the world that are now looking at that demolition. Now, having conducted its own audit into the Didcot disaster, the contractor involved said they had found precisely why the boiler house had collapsed, and said their findings, and I want to quote this directly, their findings highlighted industry-wide practices that needed to be challenged and reviewed. James Howard, who was a Coleman Company director at the time, said, "We now consider it essential." Let me try that again. "We now consider it essential to share this learning as a matter of urgency so that immediate steps can be taken within the industry to prevent future loss of life, so that the families can begin to understand what caused this dreadful accident." They were, and they continue to be, prevented from doing so, all the while this protracted investigation takes place. It hasn't happened here in the UK, but what if more demolition workers had been killed because Thames Valley Police and the Health and Safety Executive dragged their heels and prevented those findings from being shared? Would there be a subsequent 6-year investigation in order to prosecute those? My guess is there probably wouldn't. And I'm going to get back to the chat in just a second. But the other one that I think is probably the most relevant. Obviously, Ohio is over the Atlantic, long way away. The American legal system is obviously rather different to ours. But right here in our midst, the Grenfell Tower fire took place roughly 18 months after the Didcot incident. The Grenfell investigation looked into almost 20 times as many deaths and sifted through evidence that would surely have been compromised or destroyed entirely by the fire. And yet, we already know the cause of the fire, we know where it started, and we know what caused the fire to spread with such ferocity. And as a direct result of those findings, the government has published its building safety bill. It has changed the entire structure of building safety legislation here in the UK. They managed to do that in under 4 years. And yet, Didcot, 6 years on, we are no further forward. Let's go back to the chat. Sadie, it's my absolute... No, it's not my privilege. I'm going to do a slight aside here. And I know it's a cliche to say it, but the dignity that the 4 families have shown throughout this is remarkable and almost inexplicable. If that had been my father or my grandfather or my uncle or my son or my brother that had died, I would not have acted with the dignity that you, Sadie, and your family and the other 3 families have shown. I would have been on TV effing and blinding. I would have been super gluing myself to the Health and Safety Executive front door. I think it is to your enormous credit the fact that you have shown such patience and such dignity throughout. So, just as I say, that is an aside. A lot of people that watch this show regularly will be well aware of this. I lost my mum on the 31st of January this year. And the difference with that, I said at the time she'd lived a very full life. She had 2 children. Let me think. Two children. Let me think. 5 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. Happily married her entire life. Had so many friends, so many relatives that survived. And right at the very end, she was very ill, and she was taken into hospital. And we knew, and she knew, that she had run her course, that her days were up, and there was nothing more that could be done. And that was communicated to her. So myself, my sister, and my father all got to say goodbye. My father kissing my mum for the final time is something that will live with me for as long as I live, I would imagine. But I said at the time, I gave the eulogy at my mum's funeral, and I said at the time that the remarkable thing about that final kiss between the 2 of them was the fact that it wasn't unusual at all. It was exactly the same kiss that I'd seen thousands of times over the years. I was given the opportunity to say goodbye, as was my sister, as was my father. The families of the 4 men that were killed on that day didn't have that privilege. They sent them off to work. I mean, I know a couple of the guys I think were based up in up in Rotherham, so my guess is they were probably not travelling back and forth each day. But their families would have sent them to work either on the Monday morning or on the day that it happened, expecting them home for dinner or expecting them home for the weekend, and they had plans and that kind of thing. And those plans never, ever came to fruition. I mentioned Gail Cresswell earlier. Thank you for keeping the Didcot Disaster in the radio mark. No one should go to work and not come home. Our dad, our mum's husband, our children's granddad, God bless the Didcot Fort. Gail, I'll say the same to you as I said to Sadie. Just enormous admiration for your dignity throughout all of this, and I'm so sorry for your loss. It seems so trite to say it. I know what my personal feelings. I've had that said to me a lot over the past few weeks, and it is just one of those things that you say. I'm not entirely sure it means anything. It's a nice thing to say, and I appreciate it when people say it. And thank you for that, Sadie. But no words that I could say here or anywhere else is ever likely to make any difference to the families of the 4 guys that were so tragically killed on that day. But I think with each passing day, and this is where I'm coming from on all this, with each passing day, we are actually compounding the original incident. We are prolonging the agony of the 4 families. We are placing at risk. We were placing at risk more so, I think, UK demolition workers. But I've said this countless times, because the demolition industry learns from experience and learns from global experience as well. I still, to this day, if I travel overseas in a working capacity, I am still asked about Didcot. Do I have any insight onto what caused the incident? When are the findings likely to emerge? Because we have power stations here in the US, in Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Holland, literally right across the world, and I am still being asked that to this very day. And as a result of the protracted way in which this investigation has been handled, I can't provide those people with answers. So the 4 families here know the pain of sending their workers, their relatives, their loved ones off to work on a power station demolition. But they are also now aware that there are other families doing precisely the same thing around the world. And for the sake of somebody actually having the balls to stand up and say, we need to release, even if it's preliminary findings on the Didcot investigation, at least somebody might have their life saved. We can update our working methodologies. As a result of that, we might actually be able to save somebody's life. We've had a message here. I worked for Coleman's for about 4 years, left about 2 years prior to Didcot Disaster. I was in touch with the operators who were there that day afterwards, and they weren't allowed back on site to try to recover the missing bodies. At the time, they could have still been alive but trapped, and whilst the HSD investigation went on. I'd heard that before. In actual fact, I heard from somebody else that was there on the day, who has no reason to lie about such things, but who said that once the incident had happened and either the police or the HSE or a combination thereof were on site, the recovery operation largely consisted of people walking around shouting, "Can you hear me? Is anybody able to hear me?" And it goes against fundamental human nature, as far as I'm concerned. When you see the aftermath of things like earthquakes, and there was the building collapse in Miami about a year ago. The human reaction to that is to get in there and dig with your hands, dig with any tools that you've got at your disposal. And bearing in mind this was an active demolition site, my guess and my assumption is there would have been some very heavy equipment there that could have started to pull and drag some of the debris out of the way. Now, I do realise, I'm fully cognizant of the fact that you start to move debris, you could actually cause more harm than you're preventing. I'm well aware of that. But to just say, to say to people that had worked side by side with the guys that were trapped, even if those guys had already been killed in the immediate aftermath of that incident, to say, stand aside, don't dig for them, don't look for them, just goes against everything. And there's a couple of things that have come to light. This is one of them. One of the guys that worked for Coleman's told me yesterday, when they went into cabins, half the rescue crew were asleep doing nothing. I'm sure that will come out in the fullness of time. But I also saw on social media yesterday kind of the flip side, I guess, of one of the very few positives that I saw when I was there the day after. I arrived at Didcot the following morning, and there were local people, and there's one I remember particularly, but there were local people who were arriving carrying baskets of sandwiches. And the one that I remember, there was a lady carrying literally a wicker basket, something straight out of an episode of Miss Marple, carrying a wicker basket. She went up to a couple of policemen. Now, bearing in mind, this is the end of February, and it was bitterly, bitterly cold. And she arrived with a couple of packs of sandwiches and a thermos flask of tea or coffee or whatever it might be, and she just handed it to policemen. Didn't stand and have a chat because she knew they were on duty. Just handed it over and went. And she was not alone. You know, the people of Didcot were incredibly helpful, and there were emergency services set up to keep the rescue workers fed and hydrated while they searched for the bodies. And then somebody told me yesterday, and there is actually a photograph. I'm not going to post it here because I find it so bloody annoying. I almost swore properly then. There were rescue workers, in inverted commas, stood in a makeshift marquee with sandwiches and flasks or cups of tea and whatever, and they were posing for photographs with big smiles on their face. Amongst everything else about this investigation, that remains one of the most distasteful things I think I've ever heard, and certainly I've ever seen. We've had another comment here from our friend Steve Forrester. They weren't allowed near the building thereafter, as the rest of the building remaining upstanding was deemed too unstable. I can't understand why remote excavators weren't used. Well, obviously, ultimately they were, but it was, what was it, 5 months later or thereabouts that they finally sent in some remote controlled excavators. But again, I will go back to my mention of the natural disasters like an earthquake or a flood. I realise that the health and safety executive have a role to play, and I realise that their job is to safeguard the living and to make sure that they are not injured further while searching for the injured or the dead. But that time that was taken of throwing a cordon around the site, of not actually going in, you know, will we ever know if one of those guys, or all four or three of those guys, because Mick Collins was recovered fairly quickly, will we ever know how long they survived after that? In the nicest possible way, and I mean this with the utmost respect to the families, I hope that they were killed by the initial impact. I hope that they didn't suffer. I hope that they weren't laying there in the vain hope that somebody might find them and reunite them with their families. But will we ever know? Matt Mowat, they wouldn't let us anywhere near the collapse. All the men on site wanted to do was get our workmate out from under this mangled mess, and rightly so. That's exactly what human nature would do. And we do work in an industry of enormous camaraderie. In many ways, I've likened it to the armed forces before. You know, we those that work within, I only sit on the periphery, but those that work within the demolition industry rely upon each other for their very survival. Everyone looks out for each other. You're always looking for hazards and what have you. And every man relies on the man or the woman working immediately to their left and immediately to their right. So when that boiler house came down, I would imagine, I don't know how many guys are on site, and if anybody would like to tell me, I'd love to hear it. But if those guys had been able to, I'm sure you'd have had dozens of guys willing and able to go in to try and rescue the four guys. It may have been a search in vain. It may well have been. You know, we are led to believe that around 15 to 20,000 tons of steel came down when that boiler house partially collapsed. As I say, it may have been a search in vain. But that's a chance that you're willing to take, surely, isn't it? I'm sure we could have called on Nest to help with the rescue. Unfortunately, Nest at the time didn't exist, which again is another great reason for Nest to exist. But, and here's an important point, and I'm not sure if Paul Ford from who is heading up the Nest team at the moment, if he's watching, I'd love to get his take on this. Nest is a network of experts that are, you know, mixture of structural engineers and demolition people and what have you, and they are able to carry out search and rescue and, you know, making buildings safe and that kind of thing. But in order to do so, they need to be given the nod from whoever is in charge of that site at the time. And my understanding in the instance of Didcot was that literally, as the dust was still in the air, the Thames Valley Police and the Health and Safety Executive took ownership of that site, and probably wouldn't have allowed any investigation or any rescue attempt to take place without their say so. Matt Malloy, good morning, Matt. Good to see you here. Police have all the evidence. I don't understand why they can't release the report. It's a good question, and I mean, bearing in mind, I'm just going to check back because I want to make sure I've got my facts and figures absolutely correct. Back in July of last year, the police reported that they have 2,429 witness statements and 185,000 digital artifacts, whatever the hell that means. So, let me think. September, October, November, December, January, February. In the 7 months that have passed since that statement was issued, what's happened to those witness statements? What's happened to those digital artifacts? Are they being pored over for some hidden clue, or are they locked away in a basement somewhere, never to see the light of day? The investigation will, I am still assured, I am sure it will ultimately come to a conclusion. But we are now 6 years in, and there is no sign of that happening, to the point where I'm now starting to wonder if we will ever actually see any resolution on this. And bearing in mind, we're talking about a power station which was in the ownership of an energy company that is extremely wealthy. So even if, while I'm on air now, the Thames Valley Police announced that they had concluded their findings and they were about to start a prosecution of somebody, how long is it going to take to get that to court? 6 months, a year, maybe 18 months? And then how long is that court case going to take? Look at the investigation and the prosecution over Grenfell. It's been going on for months and months and months. So even if, by some miracle, Thames Valley Police saw the error of their ways, and while I'm chatting here now, announced to the watching world that they were going to place this into the hand of the court, and they are going to name the accused and detail what they are accused of and everything else, we still could be looking at 2024, 2025 before we get any sort of answer. Let's have a look. Yes, Steve, we found out via BBC News and had to ring around to find out what the hell had happened. Ringing hospitals to see if our dad was there. No one contacted us until around 9 p.m. on the 23rd of February. I can certainly vouch for that. Certainly when I arrived the following morning, there was lots of talk. I'm going to play the video in a second because it will allow me to have a drink, but I'll play you the video from last year in just a second. But there was a couple of rumours that were doing the rounds actually at Didcot itself. There was some uncertainty to the number of people that were actually missing. And part of that was down to the fact that there was talk among local people about the fact that there were likely to be underground tunnels and underground basements, and maybe one or more of the three missing guys had managed to find themselves a way into there and was alive, but just temporarily buried. But there was also some suggestion that maybe one or more of the guys had actually left the site, popped up the road for a cup of coffee. I can't see why, because there was a canteen on site, but popped up to the McDonald's that's a mile and a half up the road. Again, no good reason why they would be doing that, but there was that slight concern that we didn't have a firm head count, even though in order to get into the site you had to go through a checkpoint and everything else. But that was just as far as the media were concerned. This is the first I'm hearing that the fact that the families, or at least one of the families that were involved, didn't hear about this until 9 o'clock at night. And I know from my own memory, I got a phone call from Sky TV at about 6 o'clock in the evening to ask me to go up to Didcot. And by that time, the TV news was full of it. If I remember rightly, and again, passage of time, and it is 6 years, but I'm fairly sure at least one of the TV networks, and it may well have been Sky, was actually broadcasting live. It was almost a, stop the news, we're going to focus entirely on this. And I recall that going on for hours. So the families of those four guys, or at least one of those four guys, found out about the incident via TV, which is doubly painful. When I saw the news, the first phone call I made was to Mick. It rang to voicemail where I left a message saying, "I hope everything is okay, mate. Ring me back." I don't know if that phone survived. I don't know if that phone's ever been recovered. It's little things like that really get to me. And I'll tell you too, the first one that gets me is on my phone. I've still got a couple of answer phone messages from my mum. The chances are, they're not saying much more than "Hello, it's me. Give me a call back." I've not actually been brave enough to listen to them yet. I haven't heard her voice in since before Christmas, 2 weeks before Christmas, because unfortunately she was rushed into hospital, and as part of her treatment she had to have a tracheostomy, so she was unable to speak for 6-7 weeks. So that phone message is painful. And somebody, I can't remember who it was, it may have been Gary Muirhead, but somebody told me a story a little while ago about the fact that they'd been working on a site where there had been a fatality. And when they all left that night, the car park was empty, all bar one car, and that car belonged to the guy that had been killed. It's changed now, but I've, as I say, I've been to Didcot on a number of occasions, and you come down off the main road from the town. There's a couple of little roundabouts, and then you go through a little sort of windy industrial estate, and there is the power station. And the power station, the approach to it is laid out as a car park that will hold 50 or 60 cars, I suppose. Now, I don't know what mode of transport the four guys were using. They may have arrived together, they may have arrived individually, but when the dust settled on the 23rd of February, the chances are there were one or two cars there that were just there as a reminder of the fact that those guys had walked through the gates and hadn't walked back out again. We've got some more comments, but I could do with a drink. Let me play this for you. We recorded this this time last year. At the time, I still had some hope that we would see some quick resolution to all that was going on. The bit that I think is most telling is the fact that the final words are something along the lines of, "We don't have any answers, and we still don't." Or here we are, 365 days later, and that statement remains as true today as the day I said it. So while I grab a drink, here's the video. "5 years ago tomorrow, I was stood on this exact spot. In front of me was a Sky TV cameraman, and slightly to my right was a Sky TV presenter. It was bitterly cold. All of us had arrived while it was still dark. But as the sun came up, I realised why we'd chosen this spot. Because over there was a scene of utter devastation. It was the scene of a collapsed boiler house. None of us knew it at the time, but what we were looking at was the worst demolition disaster in living memory."
I'm standing at the entrance to Didcot A. As John was saying there, this is the site that is being decommissioned. Some cooling towers remaining. And here at the entrance, a tight police cordon.
Fire and rescue teams from around the country are helping in this operation. One demolition worker is confirmed dead, and rescuers do not hold out much hope for the 3 who are still missing.
Oxfordshire County Council are telling us that there's been one fatality. They're confirming one fatality.
None of us could have known that 5 years later we'd still be none the wiser about what caused that accident, or that 5 years later the families of the 4 men killed on that tragic day would still be waiting to find out why their loved ones had gone to work and never came home. Many years ago, I visited Loch Ness. Obviously I didn't see the monster. But as I stood on the banks of that vast expanse of water, I understood how the myth had emerged. Loch Ness is unusually quiet. It's cold. There's something about it that's just off. I know it's only my mind making associations that aren't real, but Didcot feels like that to me now. Like there's something just not quite right. The media was camped on the road that day, and I learned a lot about the way that the media works. I came here to see Sky TV, but as my interview with Sky TV ended, somebody from the BBC approached me and asked me to do an interview with them. When I finished with the BBC, I was asked to do one with ITV, and then with Channel 4. Over the course of the day, I did 11 TV interviews, plus a whole host more with news and media outlets, including newspapers and radio stations. There was a police cordon in place that day. 2 police officers were stood here to prevent traffic from getting too close to the scene. Like the rest of us, they were freezing cold. I talked to them for a while, and while we were talking, a lady came over carrying a wicker basket that looked like a prop from an episode of Miss Marple. It contained a thermos flask and several packs of homemade sandwiches. She handed the basket to the police officers and then left. On a day filled with a growing sense of horror, that's a memory that's stuck with me ever since. I was here for both the first and the second anniversary of the Didcot disaster, both times to see the media. I was here for the 3rd and the 4th, but I was here alone. I'm here for the 5th, and I've no idea why I keep coming back, because I absolutely hate it here. I'd been driving home when I first heard news reports of an incident at the Didcot Power Station. Even though I'd been there several times at that point, my mind just didn't make the connection. It was only when I got home and my phone started to ring that I realised that the incident was demolition related. One of the things I remember from that day was how everyone was so careful in their use of language. For most of the day, everyone referred to men that were unaccounted for. It was only towards the end of the day that anyone dared utter the word missing. There was a huge amount of rumour and speculation too. Local people claimed they'd heard an explosion, and there were some initial fears that this was actually a terrorist attack. Local people attempted to reassure themselves with talk of a network of tunnels and basements in which the missing men might be hiding. Looking back, I don't think anyone was convinced. The first people to walk through these gates were the men that built the power station back in the late 1960s. Then came the men and women that kept the plant operational to provide electricity for the local region. Over the course of about 50 years, thousands of men and women walked through these gates. The last people to walk through these gates were the demolition men, responsible for taking the power station down. Over the course of more than 50 years, thousands of people walked through these gates, but 4 of them never walked back out again. The body of Mick Collins was recovered almost immediately, before the Health and Safety Executive threw a cordon around the entire site. The remains of the 3 other men would lay undiscovered for more than 6 months. They would not be recovered until after the remains of the collapsed boiler house had been felled in a controlled explosion on the morning of the 17th of July 2016. On the 31st of August 2016, 190 days after the boiler house collapsed, it was confirmed that a body had been found in the rubble. On the 3rd of September, that body was identified as Christopher Huxtable. On the 8th of September 2016, police confirmed they'd found the body of another of the remaining 2 missing men. On the 9th of September, the body was formally identified as that of Ken Cresswell. The last missing worker was found on the same day. He was identified as John Shaw. 199 days had elapsed since the day of the accident. I did about 20 media interviews the day after the accident. I've probably done about another 50 since. That's hundreds and hundreds of questions, and I fielded all of them, but I haven't answered any. There were no answers on the day after the accident. And as I stand here on the same spot that I was stood 1,826 days ago, I still don't have any answers. Sadly, painfully, and tragically, neither does anybody else. The numbers that I used in that video, it was 1,800 odd days. It is now 2,190 days since that boiler house came down. 2,190 days in which Sadie and Gail and the other families have had to wake up each day without their loved ones, and without even the comfort, if there is such a thing, or the closure, if there is such a thing, of knowing exactly what happened. I can't preempt what the BBC is going to ask me, but when I'm on there this afternoon, one of the words that is kicking around in my head is the fact that it is nothing short of a national disgrace. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Neil Edwards of the Builders Conference this morning. Neil, good of you to join us. I can clearly remember you and I sitting down at the end of February 2016 and discussing the Didcot disaster, and you said this would not be sorted for at least 4 years from your experience, which was unacceptable. Now we're 6 years, it's totally incredulous. Nothing has been delivered by way of an understanding of what went on. A producer on Netflix should get this story and bring it to the world. And he goes on to say, we don't want to sensationalise the event, but it seems to have become blocked and a new view may be required. That I think the idea of a Netflix thing. I mean, I have enough information to write a book on the subject of Didcot. The only thing that I don't have at the moment, the only 2 things I don't have at the moment, is the permission of the families and their cooperation, and a conclusion. And until we have a conclusion, I can't put pen to paper on that. I would like to, not for financial gain. I'll give the money away, don't care. But as I said yesterday, Didcot has, to a large degree, defined my career for the last 6 years. That was never an intention. I wish it hadn't. I wish nothing had happened, and I wish I was just doing this old nonsense day in, day out. But that's not the case. what got a lump in my throat was, I think it was Sadie that said they now see Didcot as a graveyard. I remember her saying precisely that. That was this time last year. Tell the BBC as it is, like you normally do, Mark. Good luck. Thank you very much indeed for that. I will certainly do my best. Obviously, we all, you do need to move on, and I understand the need to move on and progress. It was very uncomfortable watching the remainder of the boiler house being felled. Thankfully, it was done under the cover of darkness. It wasn't treated as a spectacle. But at the time that it was brought down, the 3 men were still missing at that time. And I revisited Didcot last year, and it's almost unrecognisable. And there will be houses built on that site, and that is what progress is all about. But one of the things that I struggled with was, for at least a good few years, there was a bench within sight of the opening, within a sight of the entrance to the site, and that had been used by the families to lay flowers and tributes, and that's gone as well. Of course, it's gone. You can't build a housing estate around a single bench, and nor should you. But where do those families now focus their grief? I was talking about this to my sister a couple of days ago. My parents moved down to Worthing 3 years ago, and when my mum was rushed into hospital, she was taken to Worthing Hospital, but Worthing Hospital doesn't have the best A&E department, so she was very quickly whisked off to Brighton Hospital. Now, if anyone knows geography, I'm in Epsom right now. Brighton is probably our nearest bit of coast. I like Brighton. I like Brighton a lot. I've spent weekends there. I've had fun evenings there. My kids have been there. Me and my wife used to go there for dinner and that sort of thing. Brighton now feels tainted to me. Brighton didn't kill my mum, but I'm not in any great hurry to rush back to Brighton. So where do you focus your grief? Should there have been some sort of memorial made way for it at Didcot? Maybe. Would the families have wanted that? I don't know. Would you honestly want a tribute at the place in which they perished? Perhaps not. But I'm going to come back to this in a second. It's down to you, Mark. We can come together and remember the Didcot 4. Thank you. Not a problem, Scott. Wow, I've just seen your photograph there, which obviously is not of you, but is of Mick Collins. Don't know why I didn't spot that before, but that's caught me by surprise. And it is, it is little things like that do catch you unawares. And I'll say this: I'm not going to go off on a thing about my mum, because that's not what we're talking about. But when I was giving the eulogy to my own mum, it was the little things that tripped me up. It wasn't the fact that she'd been my mum for 56 3/4 years. It wasn't the fact that she'd been married to my dad for nearly 60 years. I sailed through all of that. The bit that got me was talking about the fact my mum bought my eldest son, Ollie, a copy of the Guinness Book of Records when he was about 8 years old. And he loved it to the point where the following year he asked for another one. And the year after that, he asked for another one. Well, Ollie is nearly 30. And every year, my mum, regardless of what else he got for Christmas, guaranteed Guinness Book of Records. He didn't get one last year because my mum was in hospital. And that was a tough bit to get through on the eulogy. Thank you, Mark, for keeping Didcot out there. Bless our men. Let's hope no other families of the demolition industry ever have to go through this nightmare again. They need answers to stay safe. So sorry for your loss, Mark. And that doesn't that just go to show, right? We are talking on the anniversary of the death of Gail's husband, and she's taking time out to worry about my loss. Gail, you and your daughter, who are the two that I've probably spoken to most, are incredibly special people, and my heart goes out to you. It really does. But thank you so much for that. What about the industry's role in all of this? Ultimately, that's where I come from on all of this. As I say, I had no emotional connection to the 4 guys that perished on that day. I'm yet to meet Gail and Sadie. I hope to one day when it's appropriate to do so. Where I come from, all of this is industry related. I mentioned at the outset that we had, I think it was something like 25 fossil fuel power stations here in the UK that were due to be demolished for precisely the same reason that Didcot was, because it didn't meet modern European Union emission standards. So there was a big bunch of them that were about to be demolished. Could we as an industry have done more to force the Health and Safety Executive or Thames Valley Police to release even initial findings? What would my guess? I'm going to guess. I'm not a legal expert. My guess is contempt of court. But what would happen if somebody actually published the Coleman and Company findings? I wouldn't do it because I wouldn't want to prejudice any potential prosecution and any resolution for the families. But bearing in mind, how many people were on the Didcot site? 50, 100 maybe? And you would replicate that for each of the power stations that have come down elsewhere. So Long Gannet and Iron Bridge and all the other power stations that have come down. So over a period of the last 6 years, we have been sending hundreds, if not thousands, of men and women onto demolition sites with the knowledge in the back of our head that Coleman and Company had found something in accepted methodologies that they believed needed to be reviewed, and I can't even remember what the words were. I did have a note of these. Bear with me 1 second. I want to make sure I get the wording right. Yes, their findings highlighted industry-wide practices that need to be challenged and reviewed. Where else in the industrial world would that be allowed to be quashed, even if temporarily? Because of the health and safety record that they have, let's liken that to the airline industry, the aviation industry. So imagine that Boeing or somebody else that makes aeroplanes had spotted something within the design of aircraft or in the way in which they take off or land, and they had joined the dots and had decided, actually, there is a safer way. Do you think that they would be required to keep that under wraps? Or is it more likely that word would have gone around the entire aviation world and aeroplanes would have been grounded and airports would have been changed and their procedures would have been changed to accommodate those new findings, because ultimately we all want to safeguard people? My guess is that they would. My guess is that they would. And I realise I'm going off at tangents, I realise this, but when you think back to the Hillsborough disaster, the justice for the people that died there was a long time coming. Another absolute national disgrace. But as a result of Hillsborough and a couple of other incidents at football events, we moved away from stands. We went to all-seater stadiums because we had decided that stands were intrinsically unsafe, and therefore all of the UK's stadia were converted to all-seater. Enormous cost, and there were delays and so on down the line. So how is it that that can happen in football? It happens in aviation. And I will go back to Grenfell again. That investigation and that prosecution is still not concluded. And yet the government has had the ability to analyse the findings, find out where the fire started, how it spread, and so on down the line. They issued a guidance, a set of guidance a year or more ago. That was put out for consultation. And when that consultation came back, that was turned into a new building safety bill. Actual full-blown legislation governing the construction industry has changed as a direct result of Grenfell. And that's taken under 4 years. 6 years, and we don't even know what caused the boiler house to fall down. We don't know if anybody individually was to blame. We don't know if any company was to blame. We don't know if there was something within the design of the power station that was to blame. We don't know if there was anything wrong with the demolition method that was to blame. We don't know if there were faults in the steel used to erect that that boiler house. We don't know if the client was putting pressure on the contractor to speed things up, to do things more quickly. We don't know anything. 6 years, 2,190 days later, and we know precisely squat. The power station should have been done by Brown and Mason. They have a great safety record for the demolition of these power stations and have done plenty of them. They're not alone. Erith have done power stations very successfully. Keltbray have done them. Demolition Services have done them now. JBV up in the northeast, they've done, or northwest rather, they've done them. I'm not for one moment suggesting that all power stations should go down one route. Much the same as, you know, if somebody asked me if I was down the pub tonight. I don't drink, so that's unlikely. And the conversation I'm about to tell you about is unlikely because nobody's ever going to ask me. But if somebody were to take me to one side in a pub and say, I have a bridge needs demolishing, who should I get to do it? My immediate default answer would be Armac. Armac are brilliant, absolutely brilliant at taking down bridges. As good as anyone in the world. But they're not alone. Other people can do it. Other people can do power stations. But, you know, as Coleman and Company were very quick to point out, not long after the Didcot disaster, they hadn't done a power station before. Again, you know, I would ask the question, you know, is there a piece of paper within that, whatever it was, all of those artifacts and digital artifacts, is there a piece of paper that says, and the smoking gun is the fact that Coleman and Company had never done a power station before? A lot of people went from Brown and Mason to Coleman's. Knowledge was there in the guys doing the work. It's the ivory towers that had failings. Yeah, I mean, there certainly was some transition there, and you know, ultimately we are talking about an industry in which people are nomadic and they do take their expertise from one place to another. And I know some of the people that were working at Coleman's have since gone on to other companies and they've taken that expertise with them as well. I wonder with all of this, I'm going to throw that one back up again. Who's to blame here, right? So bearing in mind the length of time and the depth that this investigation must have taken, if it transpires that the investigating authorities believe that one of the contributory factors to that boiler house collapse was the fact that Coleman and Company were inexperienced. Now, as Sadie has rightly said there, they had brought in experienced people. I know some of them, and they are as good as anyone in the industry. But Coleman and Company hadn't done a power station before, and let's, for argument's sake, say that the Health and Safety Executive or Thames Valley Police believe that to be a contributory factor. Whose fault is that? Is that Coleman and Company's fault? They bid for a job alongside, one would assume, alongside some of the usual suspects. I would guess that Brown and Mason were in for it. I would guess that Erith were probably in for it. I would guess that Keltbray were in for it, and possibly others as well. They bid for that job, and somebody within the client decided they're our boys right there. Now, bearing in mind the magnitude of that project, the scale, the duration, I would guess that the bidding process was long, protracted, and very, very deep indeed. I would imagine that everything about Coleman and Company was checked, double checked, and triple checked. I's would have been dotted and T's would have been crossed. They would have had their insurance details checked. They would have had their training and competence checked. They would have had their experience checked. And then somebody within the client organisation said, yeah, we've checked all of that, and we've checked it alongside, the other demolition contractors that are bidding for this major job, and it is our belief that those guys there, those guys from Birmingham, are the boys to do this job. So if, and I to this day, I am praying that this is not the case. If it turns out that the prosecuting authorities or the investigating authorities decide to level the blame at Coleman and Company, are they to blame? If they were found to have been negligent, if they had instructed their workers to work in an unsafe manner, yes, I agree, they would be to blame, they would be prosecutable, and rightly so. But if they were going about their business in full agreement with everybody on site, they'd met the client's criteria, they were doing things in a manner that had been agreed and predetermined, are they to blame? Is the client to blame? Is the methodology to blame? And at the moment, my biggest concern is the methodology may well be faulty. It's too late. It's too late to help anyone here. We're down to, I'm led to believe we've only got a couple more power stations here in the UK that are scheduled to come down through demolition in the next couple of years. So it's too late here. But speaking to a demolition expert called Joe Vendetti in the States, he believes that there are somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 around the world. And bearing in mind, if anybody is watching this and has travelled the demolition world as a part of their work, you will know that pretty much the entire world looks to the UK for leadership and guidance. We are still perceived to be the industry elite. When you look at some of the things that we've done, we were very quick to embrace demolition robots. High reach excavators really got traction here, and we were very quick to embrace the use of quick couplers and that kind of thing. So we are right at the cutting edge, and I've been fortunate enough to attend meetings of the European Demolition Association and the National Demolition Association over in the States, and I can tell you that on every occasion, when somebody from the UK gets up to speak, the world listens. Closer to home, the European Demolition Association, with the notable exception perhaps of the Italian company Despe. If a UK contractor stands up to explain how a job was done, how they went about performing a specific task, you will have an audience of demolition professionals that is absolutely rapt. They will be sat there taking notes, recording it on their mobile phones, because as far as they're concerned, the UK is a leader. And on the one occasion that the world looked to the UK for leadership on power station demolition safety, through no fault of the industry's making, the industry has been found wanting. So if you're an American or an Australian or a New Zealander or a German demolition contractor that has been fortunate enough to win a contract to take down a power station, and let's not forget, it is a very, very lucrative, and rightly so, it's a very lucrative process. But if you're lucky enough to have won the job to take down a power station, and that power station has a boiler house with a hung boiler in it, the chances are, unless you have had the ability to go back to first principles, literally go back to the very, very beginning and decide, I'm going to do this in a manner that has never been tried before. If you are going to do it using accepted methodology, you are doing so knowing full well that there is a company here in the UK that believes that that methodology is potentially flawed and certainly needs highlighting and reviewing. You're sending your workers to work at the coalface knowing full well that the methodology that is accepted throughout the industry and across the world might have a fundamental flaw. That's like sending men and women up a ladder that you know to be rickety and ready to fail. You wouldn't do it. And yet, again, I keep coming back to the fact that the investigation has been so protracted. I would like to think that this, but when the dust finally settles on all of this, and we all have an opportunity to look back, I would like to think that this case could actually set a precedent. I understand judicial process, not well. I'm not a lawyer, not a barrister, but I understand it, and I understand that we can't be seen to be preempting or prejudicing ongoing investigations. I understand that, but if you find something within that investigation that you believe could contribute to wider safety, surely the onus is upon you to share those findings in a preliminary manner. You know, we have some very, very smart people working within the legal profession. Is there not, and should there not be some legal device whereby they can ring fence a piece of information that says, as a result of our investigation into, for example, Didcot, we have discovered that this is likely to have been the cause. And if anybody else is carrying out similar work, then you must, absolutely 100% must, take into account that thing that we found. However, that does not preempt any prosecution. You know, we're not going to use that against anybody or whatever it might be. But in order to safeguard other people, we are letting the industry know exactly what it is that we found. There must. I find it staggering that there's not some legal device whereby, and let's face it, we've got that with Grenfell. We know what caused it. You know, we have a sector now, a construction sector that is now staring down the barrel of lots of cladding removal, lots of very expensive cladding removal. Why? Because even though the investigation remains ongoing and the court case remains ongoing, we know that Grenfell was exacerbated by cladding. Is that likely to prejudice the court case? No. It's public domain. We all know that. It's been on TV programs. There's been documentaries about it. There's been YouTube documentaries about it. The construction press is talking extensively about it. One of the guys over on the, I can never remember, is it Housing Today? But one of the guys there has worked very, very closely on that. All of this is public domain stuff, and we know that. And as a result, we as a nation have been able to change our legislation to make sure that Grenfell isn't repeated, because we know full well, and here is the crux. We know there are other tower blocks out there that have the same cladding and the same cladding installation methods that exacerbated Grenfell. We know exactly the same. We know there are other power stations here and overseas that will be designed in a very similar way to Didcot. with Grenfell. Grenfell has contributed to changes in legislation. In Didcot, it's just been wrapped in red tape, and I get the distinct impression that the investigating authorities were kind of hoping that the whole thing would just blow over. I don't know what they stand to gain from that. I really don't. I hate to. I mean, somebody's just said this. Let's have a look. Scott Jackson. It's all about money at the end of the day. Is it? Was it? You know, was that a contributory factor? We, you know, hopefully, we will find out. And I hate to look at finance in something that relates to the death of 4 hard-working and completely innocent men. But what has all this cost? How much has the Health and Safety Executive and the Thames Valley Police investigation cost? And how are these things paid for? I don't actually know how police funding works, but we have a situation with the Health and Safety Executive whereby they are basically, if you're a demolition contractor and an HSE inspector comes on your site, sticks around long enough and finds something over which he considers you to be fine worthy, you have effectively paid for that inspector's time, and you've paid for it in the form of a fine. Is there any financial incentive upon the HSE or the Thames Valley Police to get this matter concluded and prosecuted? Or is it an open checkbook? Is it just a blank check and you just keep going because the public coffers will certainly tolerate that? If anybody knows the answer, I'd love to hear it. Another key frustration from my point of view is how quickly everybody moved on. Day or two after the incident itself, there were MPs standing up in the House of Commons, including, if I remember right, I think even David Cameron mentioned it. He was Prime Minister at the time. And, you know, there were thoughts to the families and what a tragic event and blah, 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 and all that kind of thing. Myself and several others have written to the various MPs, both the MP for Didcot, but MPs for the areas in which the 4 men were originally based. I've even written to my local MP as well. I've done freedom of information requests on all of those people, and I get back an answer that basically a couple of lines that says the investigation is ongoing. All those MPs that were shouting and stamping their feet in the House of Commons in the immediate aftermath, where are you now? Where are you now? Why are you not beating a path to the front door of the Thames Valley Police and the Health and Safety Executive, telling them to pull their bloody finger out? Where are you? Where is the industry? Where is the NFDC, the Institute of Demolition Engineers, Build UK potentially? Where are the spokespeople for the industry? And why are they standing by and allowing this protracted investigation to take so long? I've been out of the NFDC for quite some time now, so I don't know the current situation, but certainly back in the day, the Health and Safety Executive used to sit down with the NFDC once or sometimes twice a year. And basically that conversation was largely geared towards what specific elements of the industry the HSE was planning to target in the coming months. It might have been working at height, it might have been slips, trips and falls, it might have been dust, whatever it might be. But because of the links between the NFDC and the Health and Safety Executive, the industry was given a bit of a heads up of these are the things that you need to be aware of, because there will be spot checks and there will be a campaign on these aspects. My guess is those meetings probably still take place. Have the NFDC ever once said to the health and safety executive, never mind what you're going to target over the next 6 months. What are you doing about Didcot? Why do we not have an answer on Didcot? Have they? I don't know. If anybody would like to tell me, I'd be more than happy to share that. As an ex-employee of Coleman's, worked on a fair few of their sites, I'm confident Coleman's aren't responsible for the accident with their work methods. They are, however, fully answerable for their actions in the aftermath. And I would squarely put that down to Mark Coleman and his egotistical, arrogant mannerism. I know that David Coleman would have been truly broken and devastated by the whole incident, and not on a money profit basis. It is not my job to leap to the defence of anyone here. I know David Coleman is in pretty poor health. I know he'd suffered with his health in the past, but I'm sure that the stress and the pressure that goes with all of the Didcot thing is has probably not helped. I spoke to Mark Coleman about a week, no, maybe just less than a week after the incident. I'd come up with an idea of producing a book. It was basically just a collection of my articles for a year or more. And we put that together. It was called A Sight for Sore Eyes. And some of the profits from the book went to the family fund. And when I spoke to Mark, he was very helpful and basically gave the book his backing. And you can only speak as you find. I didn't get any sense of the egotism or the arrogance. And I also spoke to Mark. I was lucky enough to go over to Japan 2019, and Mark was on the trip as well. It was a European Demolition Association fact-finding mission to Japan, and Mark was on it as well. And I came away. I never. My view of Mark didn't change. Let me put it like this: we had a good time together. You know, we had a couple of beers together, had a couple of meals together, and I personally didn't see any sign of the arrogance or the egotism. Again, I've never worked for him, and obviously, you know, you never really know people until you're that close. And as I say, speak as you find. That has certainly not been my experience of Mark. What I do know is I was at an Institute of Demolition Engineers regional meeting up in the Midlands a couple of years ago, before the entire world went berserk and COVID hit. And there was lots and lots of talk about all things health and safety. And the meeting actually got fairly heated at one point. Won't bore you with the details, but it did get fairly heated at the time. And one of the guys that worked for Coleman and Company, to illustrate just how big an impact the incident had on him personally, he stood up and he could recount to the minute how long ago Didcot was. And you got the very distinct impression that was probably his first thought in the morning and his last thought before he went to sleep at the night. I didn't get the impression from that guy and the guys that were with him that there'd been any moving on or sweeping things under the carpet. I got the impression that they were living and suffering with that every single day. And let's not forget that. Ultimately, I guess that the health and safety executive and the Thames Valley Police will be looking to appoint blame. But nobody involved in any of this will have done any of this deliberately. The client will not have picked a demolition contractor that they thought to be incompetent, that they thought to be incapable. They will have picked the company that they thought delivered the best solution and quite possibly the best value as well. Coleman and Company themselves will have, and I know because I saw it, they will have bought the best equipment to do that job. They brought in people from outside companies to assist. They would have had decent consultants on it. Nobody involved in that process from the very top, from the very top of the client down to any subcontractors that were employed on the job. Nobody intended for the boiler house to collapse, and nobody intended for 4 men to lose their lives. I'm of the belief that there is no such thing as an accident. I think all of these things are ultimately avoidable. But what makes them partly avoidable is experience. You learn as a kid. You put your hand on a hot kettle or near a fire and it burns your hand. You're not rushing back to do it again soon, are you? And unfortunately, that hand burning experience remains to this day locked in a vault somewhere within Thames Valley Police or at some laboratory up in Buxton in Derbyshire, where it's being analysed for the umpteenth time. And there is an entire industry out there, not so much here, as I said, but there's an entire industry out there that is looking at a power station and they're putting their hands towards the fire, and there is something within that information that might make them go, oh, no, I better not. And we as a nation are allowing that to be sat upon. What does all this say about the Health and Safety Executive? Obviously, the Thames Valley Police are leading the inquiry. They are the ones that have the forensic capabilities and what have you. But what does this say about the Health and Safety Executive? Thames Valley Police are at a slight disadvantage because my guess is they are not dealing with demolition accidents and multiple fatalities on a regular basis. The Health and Safety Executive do. That's what they do. That's what they're there for. They investigate incidents and accidents. They publish their findings and they prosecute those they consider to be responsible. You would have thought that by now they would be looking at the demolition industry and cringing in fear that another demolition power station demolition could go awry, and then somebody like me will say, you could have prevented that. What were you playing at? Why did you drag your heels for 6 months, for 6 years? And they're being allowed to do so. I said this earlier, or I said it last week actually. Who watches the watchmen? Who polices the police? My guess is ultimately the ultimate authority here is the government. But I've issued 6 or 7 freedom of information requests, and all of them come back with 2 or 3 lines of the investigation is ongoing. No further forward in 6 whole years. And I think there's an imbalance here. And the imbalance is this. If a demolition contractor were to go onto one of the couple of remaining demolition sites, used proven and well-tested methodology, and the boiler house partially collapsed, so a complete repeat of Didcot, the local police force would do precisely what they've done at Didcot. The Health and Safety Executive would do precisely what they did at Didcot. And ultimately, somebody would be looking to point the finger of blame at the client or at the contractor or at the subcontractor, exactly the same as at Didcot. And yet, we know that there might be something, or that, by all accounts, there is something within those findings from Coleman and Company that could have prevented that death. When somebody stands up in court at a future prosecution and says, sorry, my lad, but I was just following the proven methodology that we've all been using for years, does the Health and Safety Executive still sit there and rub its hands together at the financial windfall that it's about to get as a result of bringing a successful prosecution? Or does the learned gentleman with the wig on at the front say, yeah, all right, but you guys, you knew this. You knew this, and you sat on that for 6 years. Are we not at the point now where I think we're beyond the point of questions being raised? I think we're at the point where we're almost at the point, I would guess, where we need to do an upward prosecution. The Health and Safety Executive, let's make no bones about this, the Health and Safety Executive and the Thames Valley Police, through their combined inaction, are placing men and women, demolition men and women, at risk right now, today, right here, right now. I don't know the current status of the various power stations that are being demolished or about to be demolished here in the UK. My guess is there are some that are still ongoing. And as I say, through their inaction and through their refusal to allow Coleman and Company's initial findings to be published, the Health and Safety Executive and the Thames Valley Police are contributing to a safety failing within the industry. And we as an industry and we as a society and as a nation are allowing that to happen. Where do you go with that? It is my hope. I have many hopes on this. My ultimate hope is that Sadie and Gail and the other families of the four guys get some kind of resolution and some degree of closure. My other hope is that ultimately that the demolition people that were involved in that are exonerated. I would like nothing more than for that to be the case. But my other hope is that we learn from this. And I think one of the biggest learnings from this is that we cannot allow these prosecutions to run on, or investigations to run on, for 6 years and counting. And don't let's forget, excuse me 1 second, I'm drying up here. God, that's horrible. Don't let's forget here, this is not a unique incident. I've highlighted the investigation that was carried out very quickly and the resolution that was brought over in Ohio. I've also highlighted Grenfell Tower, where that obviously we all know where we are, and that's taken a shorter amount of time. But there was a second accident at a scrapyard in Birmingham, roughly 6 months to the day after the Didcot disaster. Once again, 4 men were killed. They were all migrant workers of African descent. They were crushed beneath a wall that had collapsed, presumably because of the weight of scrap it was holding it back. It couldn't actually hold that any longer. The wall came down, it landed on the 4 guys, and the 4 guys were crushed to death. That one still remains under investigation as well. Sifting through 15 to 20,000 tons of twisted steel and debris, and trying to retrace who said what to whom and what instructions were given, what procedures were followed. I understand that's extremely complex. And I certainly, I said on the day after Didcot happened, I wasn't expecting a resolution for a good 4 years. But we've exceeded that by 50% now, and we still have no resolution. But you would have thought that a health and safety executive investigation and the local police up in, I think it was the West Midlands, could look at a scrapyard and say, well, there's the wall, or there was the wall, and it was holding back that mountain of metal scrap. And ultimately, that metal scrap has shifted, or the wall has given way, the whole lot's gone over, and the 4 guys that were stood behind it have been crushed. I reckon a 5-year-old could figure that out. Now, okay, you do need to look back through procedures. You know, how was the wall designed? Was it designed to take a certain weight? Had that weight been exceeded? Were the men in an area where they shouldn't have been? Had they snuck off for a quiet cigarette behind a wall where actually they were forbidden to be? And so on down the line. But you would have thought pretty much cut and dried. There was a wall, there was some scrap moved, wall collapsed, men died. There you are. And I'll go back to this preliminary finding. You would have thought that based on that information alone, a guidance could have been issued to all of the scrap merchants and scrap processors in the UK. Excuse me. Itchy nose. Could have been issued to all of the scrap dealers and scrap merchants in the UK to say, if you have retaining walls with scrap pushed against it, you need to reduce the weight of that scrap, or stop doing that altogether, or prop the wall, or do something else, or make that part of an excluded zone as part of your site. To the best of my knowledge, that hasn't happened. We've had another question here. You have to ask why the families weren't contacted immediately after the incident happened. There would have been a head count of missing persons logged directly after the boiler house collapsed. The question would have been asked to Mark Coleman. Shall we contact the families involved? Surely. I don't know. That sounds like the procedure that you would follow. But again, you know, I will go back and bearing in mind, I arrived. Let me think. I arrived probably 10 hours, 12 hours after the incident happened, and even at that point, there was no categorical clue as to precisely how many people were missing, or how many men were missing. As I mentioned earlier, there was a possibility that maybe somebody had popped off site for a cup of coffee or a burger or whatever it might be. They may have been in another part of the site. They may have been in some underground basement or whatever it might be. I'm pretty sure, and as I say, I'm not here to defend Coleman and Company or Mark Coleman or anybody in the decision making process. But I think it was such a fast moving incident. My guess is it would have taken quite some time to get a proper handle on exactly what had happened. Again, that's not. I'm not looking to defend against any such accusations, and ultimately that will come out of the woodwork at some point when we finally get to a court case, I guess. But there's so much to take away from this. And have we learned anything? If, not necessarily a power station, but if there was a demolition collapse this afternoon or tomorrow, and several men, let's say 4, because be consistent, 4 men we decided they were missing. Would there now be a different procedure in place to inform the families? Would there now be a different procedure in place to attempt a recovery or a rescue? Would there be a different set of processes followed to ascertain the cause? Would there be a different set of methodologies to carry out the investigation and to bring some kind of possibly prosecution or resolution? Or would we go down precisely the same path as we've trodden for the last 6 years with Didcot? And my personal belief on that is there has been no change. No change whatsoever. Just to be clear, it wasn't an explosive demolition that brought the boiler house down. It did ultimately, but the boiler house was being prepped for explosive demolition. But there were no explosives involved in that collapse, that initial collapse. However, in the immediate aftermath of that incident, I know for a fact, because I've spoken to a good many of them, that a lot of demolition contractors that specialise in explosive demolition were contacted by the health and safety executive, and they were told to rethink and revisit their methodologies based upon the Didcot collapse. Now, as I say, that we hadn't got to the point of explosives at that point, but I know for a fact that anybody involved in explosive demolition very quickly ran around, checked, double-checked and triple-checked their methodologies, the explosives they were planning to use, the way in which that was stored, every single aspect, I think, of that process. Bear with me 1 second. Alexa, stop. Of all the times, yeah, those demolition contractors had to rethink and revisit their entire methodology because the health and safety executive had made it known that they needed to do so. Did that last? My guess is not. Did anybody amend their working practices as a direct result of the Didcot disaster? Not that I'm aware of. Did anyone involved in the power station demolition activity reach out to Coleman and Company for a quiet word over a cup of coffee somewhere in the hope that they might learn something? Maybe. But that's not how the industry is supposed to work. I have precious little to do with the Institute of Demolition Engineers and the National Federation of Demolition Contractors these days, for reasons I won't bore you with. But the one thing those, particularly the IDE, particularly the Institute of Demolition Engineers, they have two annual seminars. They have regional seminars, but they have two national seminars, one in London, around about September time, and they have one in Leeds. I think it's this week, actually. I'm not attending, but that's a whole other story. But those are an ideal opportunity for people to stand up and share experience. And I know, and I can certainly name one of them, I know that Richard Dolman at AR Demolition stood up and talked about a roof demolition that went awry, and he was very open about it. And he was open about it, bearing in mind he is the current IDE president. He was open about it because he believed that the industry, the wider industry, could potentially learn from his experience, and not a wholly positive experience. So that is what the IDE seminars are designed to do. But because of the situation that we've had with the Thames Valley Police and the Health and Safety Executive, we're in a situation now where you can't stand up and say, here is what went wrong at Didcot, here is the things that you need to avoid, don't do this, and then potentially broadcast that to the entire demolition world. And I'll say this now, not that it counts for anything at all, but if anybody, once all of this is over and done with, and when all this is over and done with, if anybody wants to use this channel, this platform, 100% free of charge, to broadcast a bulletin to the global demolition brotherhood and sisterhood, to say, we have analysed to the nth degree what happened at Didcot. The learning from that is this, and this. If you find yourself taking down a boiler house with a hung boiler, these are the things to look for, these are the things to avoid, and these are the things that you most absolutely 100% should never, ever do. That offer is there. If anybody wants to use this platform, now bearing in mind this is the biggest demolition platform in the world, in addition to the people that watch this and on YouTube and on Facebook and various other bits and pieces, we've got another 140,000 odd people on Instagram from around the world. This platform is open for precisely that, and we've had it in the past. We've had Mike Keogh at C&D Consultancy talking about the potential hazards of car park demolition and car park collapses. We've had Paul Ford from the author of the Dangerous Structure Emergency Response, because that is information that needs to be learned, and it needs to be learned broadly. And I've got a couple of final messages, and one of those final messages is, when this is all over and done with, any information arising should not be contained within a silo. It's had that for 6 years. when those findings are ultimately published and prosecutions are brought against whoever, that information needs to go as far and as wide as possible, not just to the NFDC, not just to the IDE, not just to the EDA in Europe, not just to the NDA in America. It needs to go to everyone. And I'll tell you now that you cannot rely upon the industry trade press to do that for you, because they are not up to the job. Bearing in mind, we are 6 years on, okay? Construction News has reported quite consistently on the Didcot disaster. Construction Inquirer has done a bit, Construction Index has done a bit, and I'm fairly sure that Demolition and Recycling International has done a bit. This platform right here has done 10 times more than all of them combined. And there are other demolition magazines out there that just want to portray all of this as sweetness and light. You know, the entire industry is a bed of roses. All the time this industry is portrayed as a bed of roses, more men and women will perish within it. So let's get this prosecution done. Let's get this investigation closed, and let's spread that message as far as we possibly can. Fantastic show today, my friend. Wonderful 6th anniversary tribute to Didcot 4 for keeping fight for justice for these poor guys and their families alive. Thank you for that, Gary. I take no credit and no delight in it. I'd much rather be talking about something really, really stupid. Anybody that's tuned into our Saturday shows will know, you know, nothing is off the table. I think in previous episodes we've covered the ownership of donkeys, the toilet habits of crane operators, and the joys of pizza. So nothing is off limits, and I'd much rather be talking about all of that than I would this. There was a video released from an experienced demo cutter who had studied the video footage from the Didcot fallout, and he zoomed in on cuts that had been made to the box girders that had been made, and coupled with the weight of the huge boiler that was still hanging in place, he demonstrated with a fag packet on his desk the strength of how it was cut, then how it should have been cut. It made for some interesting thought. Yeah, I've seen some of that. I heard. Oh, listen, I've heard rumours aplenty. Both, I mean, literally. There's a guy on here. I can't see him in the chat, but my guess is he's probably watching this. I've told him this before, but I'll tell you now. I was one of the places that I was asked to be during the first day after. I went up for Sky TV, but I then spoke to BBC and ITV, and all of them were looking for their own camera angle. And one of them, and I think it was ITV, had spoken to a local family, and they'd agreed to allow us to film in their back garden. It was I say back garden, it was more like a paddock, you know, huge thing, and the cooling towers of the power station were in the background. So from a visual point of view, it looked very, very smart. So we drove around to there, we parked our cars. I was getting mic'd up, and the cameraman was putting his camera together, and the lighting guy was doing his thing, and the presenter was on the phone to the studio talking about the timing of what they were going to do. So while all this was taking place, I received a phone call from somebody that had worked at Didcot. Now, bearing in mind, I am about to go live to the nation and speak, I guess, defensively for the demolition industry. And the call that came in was basically along the lines of, we saw this coming. Now, was that a disgruntled former employee? Possibly. Did he have an actual axe to grind? Possibly. Was he telling the truth? Possibly. And until we get the prosecution findings and the investigation findings, we may never know. Now, I did mention earlier that I am supposed to be on BBC South in roughly an hour's time. So my plan is to draw a line under all of this, although there are still people in the chat. I will start to wind this down. But for those that missed it, I'm going to go back to something that we did at the very beginning of this part of the show, because I've been talking about the Health and Safety Executive and Thames Valley Police and the demolition industry and the National Federation of Demolition Contractors and the Institute of Demolition Contractors and the European Demolition Association and Build UK and the National Demolition Association in the US. And I've been talking about all of those big organisations and those big bodies and everything else. But when it all comes down to it, Didcot was not about big organisations. It was not about big companies. It was about 4 men, and has subsequently become about the families of those 4 men. So to wind things down, here is the daughter of Ken Cresswell in a message that she sent to me yesterday. There's a lot in that, but the one that I will leave you with is that final sentence. They were just 4 hard-working men going to work to provide for their families. Regardless of the ultimate findings of that investigation and prosecution, regardless of what was contained within the methodology and everything else, the demolition industry in the UK has, on its watch, has seen 4 hardworking men die. And for the past 6 years, the industry has basically sat on its hands. I realise that the pursuit of the outcome shouldn't fall to the industry, but we are long past the point where I think we've all realised that the Thames Valley Police and the Health and Safety Executive are in no hurry to deliver those findings. So, based upon Sadie's words there, and based upon everything that I've experienced over the past 6 years, I would like to call upon everybody in the demolition industry to write to their MPs, write to the local newspapers, and radio stations, TV channels, and let's make their life absolutely bloody miserable, because that is precisely what they've done to 4 families who deserved so much better. No thanks necessary, Steve, and thank you for being here. I can't think of a particularly fitting way to sign this off. All I would say is that I wish the Health and Safety Executive and the Thames Valley Police had shown the determination and the bravery and the commitment that the 4 families have shown. Those 4 families deserve answers. The 4 men that perished deserve for their memory to be honoured far better than they are being at the moment. And I'm about to sign off, and I'm going to leave you with that. Not some bumbling journalist who just writes about this stuff for a living. Not a policeman. not a health and safety executive, not some bigwig in a demolition company. That is the words from the widow of one of the men that died and shouldn't have done. Gail, thank you for that. I'm going to call it a day now. Get ready for the BBC. But thank you so much for being here, particularly to Sadie and to Gail, but to everybody else. Thank you for all your contributions and your memories of what remains the industry's darkest day. Try to have a good day. I say this every day, and some of you that aren't here very often may not be aware of this, but I'm going to reiterate what I say at the end of every show. Stay safe. Look after yourself. Your family in particular, your friends in particular, your colleagues in particular, and try to have a good day. Thanks so much for watching.